Good morning and welcome. My name is Greg Metzger, part of the team at New City Press. Together with our co-sponsors, The Initiative and Gardner-Webb University School of Divinity, we are so glad you joined us. The notion of Baptists and Catholics as partners on the pilgrimage to unity may at first blush seem preposterous. After all, in many parts of the world, including in parts of North America, Catholics and Baptists often see each other as rivals, not partners. But as the Baptist theologian and ecumenist Steve Harmon demonstrates in his new book with us, Baptists, Catholics, and the Whole Church, and as Steve has seen firsthand in his extensive dialogue work with Catholics, there are profound reasons to be hopeful that the relationships between Baptists and Catholics can indeed be fruitful. We are so pleased to have Steve with us from North Carolina, where he lives and teaches at Gardner-Webb University School of Divinity. Steve, good to see you and great to have your new book out with us.
Thanks very much.
To explore these themes in conversation with Steve, we are happy to welcome Dr. Paul Murray. Paul is a noted Catholic ecumenist and developer of Receptive Ecumenism. He comes to us from his home in Durham in the UK, where he lives and teaches and writes, and we're happy to have him join us today. We've asked Paul to lead a discussion with Steve and also with you all as well in terms of your questions being welcomed through the Q&A box. So if you do have any questions as the discussion goes on, please feel free to put them into the Q&A box, and later on we'll have some time to address some of those questions. But for now, I'm happy to hand things over to Paul to guide our time.
Well, thanks very much, Greg, and good to see you again and to be with you again, Steve, to discuss this great new book of yours, and welcome everybody. Steve, this is your fifth monograph. Tell us a little about who are you writing for? Who is your target audience, and what are you wanting them to hear in this book? Why have you written this particular book?
Some of my writing has been for more academic readerships. This is not an academic monograph, although if readers follow up on endnotes, they'll find a lot of that kind of writing there. I'm really writing for the whole church, including laypersons who I hope will be interested in the movement for greater visible unity of Christ's followers. Also, their ministers, for theological educators who may have the opportunity to form ministers who in turn will form Baptists and Catholics and others in the whole church, so that they see this as important.
That's such an important part of the ministry of being an academic theologian, to remember that the conversations we engage in come from the life of the church and need very much to be connected with the life of the church and to feed into it. So it's a great thing you're doing there, Steve. Perhaps it might be interesting to people for you to reflect for a few minutes on the kind of arc of your work and what you've been up to in your other works, and how this work fits into that substantively in terms of the kind of ideas you're working with. 4 of your works now have been explicitly in the area of ecumenism in different ways. So it would be interesting to get your sense of how that all hangs together and what each of them does relative to the others.
I did not set out initially to be a Baptist ecumenical theologian. When I sensed a calling to ministry and began theological education in preparing for that calling, I came to discern that as especially a calling to be a theological educator. And I thought at first that I would be a New Testament scholar. This is another story I could tell more fully on another occasion, but a seminary professor of mine persuaded me that Baptists had all the New Testament scholars they needed, but we needed somebody to do work in patristic theology, the thoughts of the early church fathers and mothers of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and later centuries after the New Testament. So I ended up doing my doctoral studies in that area. I wrote a dissertation on an aspect of patristic theology, especially in the thought of Clement of Alexandria and Origen and the 4th century church father Gregory of Nyssa, and their interest in the salvation of all people and how they marshaled biblical texts and supported that idea. That was published as my first monograph about the time or a few years after I began teaching in a Baptist-related school of divinity with students who were not exclusively Baptist. We had students from a wide variety of other Christian traditions, and I sought to relate my teaching of systematic theology to their traditions as well, so that they would be formed in Presbyterian and Methodist and Pentecostal theology and the best insights of those traditions, and not simply receiving Baptist theology from me. During those years, I was also wrestling with the tension between the kinds of things that we encounter happening in the church after the New Testament and my own Baptist tradition that had so prized New Testament faith and practice as the resource for the renewal of the church. That led me increasingly to begin writing about how the Baptist tradition might relate to this broader Christian tradition that had preceded us. Along the way, I began to be invited to be a part of Baptist World Alliance dialogues, first with the Anglican Communion, and then 2 series of conversations with the Catholic Church and some pre-conversations with Eastern Orthodoxy. The outgrowth of all that is reflected in the last 4 books that I've published, Towards Baptist Catholicity, Ecumenism Means You Too, which Paul, you so graciously blurbed on the back cover, and most recently, Baptist Identity and the Ecumenical Future. What I had not yet done in any of these books was very specifically focus on the Baptist Catholic ecumenical encounter, although it did get references illustratively along the way. In this book, I wanted to engage that directly, partly because there may be no more seemingly polar opposite traditions than the Baptist tradition on the one hand and the Catholic tradition on the other. But if we are able to find convergences between these so very different traditions, the rest of the church may be able to find themselves in those convergences too.
That's fascinating, Steve. So this is where it kind of touches down in that specific area, one of your many areas of involvement in the life of the church, in Baptist Catholic dialogue. And I think people might be interested to hear about the way in which you mean that at different levels. You mean it at the kind of formal international level of bilateral dialogue between the traditions, but you also mean it at very local level and regional level. So perhaps it would be interesting to tease some of that out, and how that is, how what you're doing when you meet in some far-flung corner of the world as a group of Baptist theologians and a group of Catholic theologians, how that relates and seeks to resource what can be done at the local level as well.
One of the challenges that the ecumenical movement is trying to engage right now is the fact that all too often these international bilateral dialogues at the top level, at a high academic theological level, they produce this trove of agreed statements and reports, but very few of them seem to filter down to where members of different traditions actually engage each other on the local level at the grassroots. And we have recognized this in our ongoing Baptist Catholic dialogue. That began in the 1980s with a series of conversations that was intended to clear up misunderstandings that adherents to both traditions might have of one another. ultimately so that at the grassroots, there might be the kind of relationships that fellow followers of Jesus Christ ought to have in their embodied relationships. The title of that report was Summons to Witness to Christ, because what came out of that was this sense that we do share a common Christological faith. We have one Lord. We have one summons to bear witness to our one Lord to the rest of the world. And so this constituted an invitation to Baptists and Catholics at the grassroots to do something about this. Several years ensued before there was a second series of conversations. That second series, 2006 through 2010, tackled some of the ongoing theological points of division about things like the role of Mary in the life of the church, the place of structured leadership, and what we call episcopae, or oversight in the life of the church, scripture and tradition, baptism and Eucharist. We address those matters again so that by commending these reports for study and reception in theological education at the level of local churches whose ministers might read these reports and get into conversation with the Catholic priest in their town, and maybe find ways together to educate the members of their church, their parish, and find ways to act on the rather surprising points of agreement, even about these contested matters. So that's one thing that we hope will happen. We're currently engaged in a third series of conversations that returns to that idea of the possibility of common witness. And we're talking together through some of the challenges to offering concrete forms of common witness in today's world, identifying what some of those forms of witness might be. This will issue in an invitation that we hope is crafted in such a way as to facilitate reception at the grassroots so that Baptists and Catholics in particular places around the world in relationship to each other might find ways more visibly to be the Church of Jesus Christ together and to bear witness to Christ together.
Thanks, Steve. So you've identified a number of interesting things there that in the course of formal Baptist Catholic dialogue, it's moved through a number of different moments and approaches, as it were. I mean, one has been, we start out and we've got all sorts of misunderstandings of each other and caricatures, and there's important work to be done, kind of peeling away those misperceptions and coming to a more well-grounded, a more truthful understanding of each other, a more charitable understanding of each other. But then you've also identified the importance of identifying ways in which we can say things together. We can already say so much together, and perhaps even things that we think we have disagreed about historically, find a way of speaking together. And thirdly, you've identified the importance of us being together and witnessing together, acting together. But in his introduction, Greg touched on receptive ecumenism, which is another resource that you draw upon in this work and previous works. Perhaps you could introduce our participants today to something of what receptive ecumenism is about and how it offers another approach that complements those others, but is seeking to tackle a different context in some ways.
I should first say that, Paul, most of what I've learned about receptive and ecumenism and have tried to incorporate it into my own work, I have learned from you and your groundbreaking work in that area.
Well, you're too kind, Steve, but the check will be in the post this evening for you.
The background for receptive ecumenism as an approach to ecumenical encounter that's gaining traction in the modern ecumenical movement and yet name something that's been happening quite naturally for a long time in the church too, even if not done so intentionally. The background for that is some of the initial resistance to the modern ecumenical movement and its institutions. There were worries that what people had in mind was a kind of super church, some kind of formal organic structure, whether it's the World Council of Churches or the Catholic Church in the form of a home to Rome kind of movement, or some other approach through denominational mergers. The worry was that what people wanted to do was merge everything into an organically united church under some kind of umbrella hierarchy. And what would get lost was denominational distinctiveness, or to put it another way, the good things that made Baptists Baptists and Methodists Methodists, Catholics Catholics, and Orthodox Orthodox, so on and so forth. Receptive ecumenism, though, it's not about merging denominations. Although, when some mergers have happened in different places in the Christian world, these are in fact movements toward unity. But quite apart from that kind of thing, receptive ecumenism is about recognizing that in all the different divided Christian traditions, each one of them has uniquely stewarded a set of gifts that ultimately are gifts given to that tradition by God. These gifts grow out of the unique journeys as a people of faith, historically, sociologically, culturally, that each one of these denominational traditions has had. But in that may be discerned a good gift that the rest of the church could benefit from having. Or to put it another way, each one of the traditions might be able to recognize that they, in and of themselves, do not have a corner on all of God's truth. They do not fully embody everything that God has called the Church of Jesus Christ to be. And some of the tools, some of the resources that may help particular churches, particular denominational traditions become more faithful communities of followers of Jesus Christ are to be found beyond. In the Baptist tradition, we have a lot of emphasis on the local church. Many of these resources we need are beyond the local church. They are beyond particular denominations. They are in other denominations. As each church recognizes some of these gifts uniquely stewarded by other traditions, they might be able to ask, how might we receive some of these gifts into our pattern of faith and practice without giving up the good things that makes us the tradition that we are? The emphasis, as Paul has so well put it, is not on giving people the gifts that we think they need, but rather receiving from others the gifts that we recognize we need. And this is another emphasis of Paul's, in order to become converted toward greater faithfulness to Jesus Christ.
Well, that's a beautiful articulation of the invitation and promise and challenge of receptive ecumenism, Steve. That leads me to want to ask, and it might be a question in the minds of some of our friends with us today. And I'm going to ask the question, but then speak to our friends for a moment to remind them about the Q&A. The question that prompts me is, what kind of vision or understanding of a church in full communion across the traditions does that give us? What kind of understanding of union, not uniformity, but union, does that give us? And while Steve is pondering that for one moment, let me just remind each of you today that we want this very much to be a full conversation, and there is a Q&A function in this way of using Zoom. If you're fresh to it, perhaps I should talk you through that. Along the bottom of your screen, you will see a number of icons. And I think the fourth one along from the left, at least how it's showing to me, says more with 3 dots. If you hover on that icon, it will open up a little box with a number of other options. The second one from the bottom is Q&A. If you click on that, you can put in the question or the comment that you'd like to share or ask of Steve and I, and we can broaden out the conversation to make it richer still. But while we anticipate that, Steve, let's return to what kind of understanding of a church in full communion across all the traditions does this give us?
Well, as an alternative to, or an answer to some of these concerns about merging everything under one umbrella so that distinctiveness is surrendered or lost, this is an approach to ecumenical engagement that might be more natural. We might even say spirit-led, so that as the different churches begin to receive from one another liturgical gifts of practices of worship, for example, that they are able to incorporate into their own worship. And in fact, that has been going on across traditions for a long time already. As they receive other gifts of faith and practice, eventually we may have already grown so close to one another that one day we might wake up and realize these divisions are really silly because there really are not significant church dividing points of division left. Who knows when or how that might happen? But it's part of this ongoing pilgrimage toward a future that we cannot fully envision, but are being called toward, and for which Jesus prayed when he prayed in John 17 that we might be one as he and the Father are one.
Great. So it's not so much like, when we're doing a challenging jigsaw, and at some point we're beginning to lose patience, and we kind of think if we just squeeze these 2 bits together, somehow we can force them, and it looks terrible when we do it. So it's not that we're trying to force 2 or 3 or 4 traditions as they are today to squeeze together. We are anticipating a time when each tradition has matured further, changed in the process, but changed by becoming more richly, more freely, and in the process opening up other possibilities so that greater things can happen between them than at the moment we can envisage. That's requiring us to think both big and act small and local at the same time. And I'm going to leave it that thought hanging there for a minute, and perhaps we can come back to that, what it means to live life in the Spirit now in a kind of a realized or a realizing eschatology. But I think the moment has come for us to invite our sisters and brothers who are with us today into this conversation. I'm going to hand over back to Greg to lead us in.
Paul, why don't you go ahead with that? Go ahead, carry that thought that you had there forward, and then once you guys have talked about that, I do have some really good questions that have come in. But why don't we go with what you were just leaning into there? Okay,
well, Steve, does that I know eschatology has been a long-held theme for you, right back to your patristic work. So is that something you want to reflect on for a few minutes?
Sure. If we frame the quest for Christian unity eschatologically, that puts it within the framework of what I think we find in the New Testament itself, and that is an already but not yet kind of understanding of where we fit into the realization of God's purposes for the world. Already, the new things, the last things, God's goal for all creation is here in Christ and our participation together in Christ. but that is not yet fully realized either in our ecclesial life or in our individual lives of Christian discipleship. We are not yet fully there. A vision that Jesus himself has for his church is that we be one with one another in a visible kind of way that the world can see, and thus recognize that God is doing something in Jesus Christ for the sake of the world. In light of that, then, we can recognize that our church and the whole church of all who follow Jesus, we are not yet fully under the rule of Christ in the sense of embodying his will that we be one with the kind of unity that characterizes the triune God. I think the category of pilgrimage is very important at this point. This is something that I think belongs to the roots of the Baptist tradition. The earliest Baptists among 17th century English expatriates in Amsterdam and then later in England itself were people who were looking for a church that was truly, fully under the rule of Christ and seeking to be that community themselves. That led their leaders to form a community seeking to do this, but then to recognize that there might be other communities that could be recognized as true churches too. And where those are, the fullest kind of union ought to be pursued with them. And thus, John Smith, spelled S-M-Y-T-H, the co-founder of the First Baptist Church in Amsterdam, recognized that about the local Mennonites and sought to lead his congregation to be united fully with them, which led to the First Baptist Church split, and Baptists have been doing that for a long time. But I think this is illustrative of this desire to be on pilgrimage toward more fully being a church that Jesus intends his church to be. But that also belongs to the Catholic tradition. The documents of Vatican II use this theme of a pilgrim church to envision a church that's not yet fully everything it ought to be, but is on pilgrimage toward it. The greater modern ecumenical movement in the form of the World Council of Churches and its faith and order work has also invoked this image of a church on pilgrimage. It's an eschatological image. The church we are seeking to be has not yet been. It is somewhere ahead of us in God's future. And as we more and more fully participate together in this big community-making thing that God is doing in the world and moving the world toward, then we become more fully a church under the rule of Christ. And we have to do that together and not separately.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. So we have a number of really excellent questions. We probably will not be able to get to all of them. But I do want to start, the very first question is one that I've actually encountered in some other settings as well. And it really relates directly to what's happening right now in terms of the pandemic, during this pandemic. The questioner notes that, the last couple of years during the pandemic, there's been televised presentations. A lot more people have seen the Roman Catholic Mass on TV than they ever probably have before. And he notes that in that time, a lot of the priests are offering a prayer that people can pray, a prayer of being in communion spiritually in the absence of being able to receive communion in person. And so there's a couple of questions that raise this issue of communion together. And he says, this one in particular says, how does this spiritual prayer or virtual communion compare to Baptist understandings of communion? So it's a big one to start with, but I think it's an interesting one, particularly in the midst of the pandemic and that issue.
That's a good question. And I think this too is something that unites our different traditions, and not only Baptist and Catholic, because many in my own circles, both of Baptist theologians and Baptist ministers, we've been having earnest conversations about what it means for us to celebrate communion, celebrate the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, when we cannot do it in the same space. If we have some kind of virtual alternative to that, is that really communion? For what it's worth, some of us, the theologians among us in discussing this, have found useful the Catholic distinction between sacraments proper and sacramentals that are not one of these 7 official sacraments, but they nevertheless are material means by which God encounters us transformatively. We've suggested that for those who have concerns about whether a virtually celebrated communion is really communion, we can at least say that there is something sacramental about it. It even participates in materiality. If materiality includes digital electrons and things like that, that makes it possible for us to bridge space virtually, visually, at least through some material means, we are sharing in a common act of worship. Now, I'm not going to offer any solutions for a theological definition of what is communion and what is not here. But I am simply recognizing that this is a conversation that's being held beyond Catholic circles. And I think it's a conversation that may fruitfully move us toward some other surprising convergences.
So, Paul, I'll just go ahead to the next one, or unless you have anything to add there.
I guess the only thing I would reflect on, which is slightly tangential, is, sure, in the Catholic tradition, an awful lot of emphasis is understandably and rightly placed on what's referred to as the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, in the consecrated host and wine as the body and blood of Christ. Vatican II also emphasized the multiple other presences of Christ in the liturgy, in the people, in the ordained minister, in the word. And indeed, we also, of course, need to think of the real presence of the risen Christ to us in the Spirit. And when we are not able to receive the Eucharist, either through separation of the pandemic, social distancing, or separation across traditions where it might not be considered appropriate always to share fully in each other's Eucharist, that hunger that we feel, that hunger is not simply something that is not yet there. That hunger is the presence of the Spirit in us. It's the movement of the Spirit in us. It's a real presence of Christ, even in our separation.
Thank you. So we've had a number of questions that are really engaging around the idea of on the ground, kind of local ecumenism, grassroots ecumenism among Baptists and Catholics. So there's even been some people answering people's questions, which have been really helpful, emphasizing people that have been in Bible studies, Baptists with Catholics in Bible studies. But we would like to just ask you both if you could give us some other examples that you know of or have participated in of this kind of real life engagement between local Baptist and Catholic communities.
I have not been in many settings in local Baptist churches in which the opportunity has presented itself for more direct forms of Baptist Catholic encounter. But I can mention illustratively something that one of the congregations I've participated in has done in relationship to the Anglican tradition that I think could be a model for what could happen locally between a Baptist church and a Catholic parish. This particular Baptist congregation engaged in a partnership with an Episcopal church locally to lead a vacation Bible school for their children and for the community every summer. They alternated which church would host it. Sometimes it would be at the Episcopal Church, sometimes at the Baptist Church. Leaders and teachers from both congregations engaged in teaching the children and leading activities. At the same time, the adults had a study track where we met together and we worked through the report from the International Baptist Catholic Anglican Dialogue, or Baptist Anglican Dialogue. Across several sessions, we talked about the convergences between the two traditions, ongoing points of difference, things that we appreciated about one another's practices of worship. And that became a very meaningful way to engage locally on the ground at the grassroots between two real congregations that had an opportunity to do things together in the community to bear witness to Christ. I envisioned that similar things might happen between Baptists and Catholics. As a pastor and a priest, meet together, pray together, studied the Bible and dialogue reports together. They might be able to envision some ways for things like this to happen between members of their churches.
Paul,
do I riff on that a bit?
Sure.
One thing that occurs to me to say, Greg, and all present, is that last week there was a kind of sister event to tonight, to this morning's, it's tonight for me, this morning's conversation, which was hosted by Glen Mary Home Missioners and organized by Nathan Smith. My understanding is there's going to be a web presence following on after that event with some links. And I would encourage any for whom the question Greg has articulated is the live question, to take a look, to search that and take a look at it, because there are some interesting resources. I know Greg is going to put some up himself later. I would say there are some examples where this isn't just kind of theoretical and a nice idea. In the northeast of England, over a multiple years, we organised through the University of Durham, in full partnership with the 8 major regional Christian groupings of the area. That means the 2 Anglican dioceses, the Catholic diocese, the 2 Methodist districts, the Northern Baptist Association, and the United Reformed Church, the Salvation Army Northern Division, and also for a while a grouping of Pentecostals. And it was it went from local at congregational level up to regional level, but also the intermediary where that existed. It was fascinating. One of the things that came clearly out of that for the Catholic communities, and this relates to Christopher Schellen's question, one of the things that came out of that was the way in which the parochial pastoral council in a Catholic context, which frequently can be quite lackluster in its performance, that what can be learnt there about the theology and practice of discernment in community from the role of the church meeting in the Baptist congregation. I mean, clearly there is a massive difference at the level of authority that pertains there, which is to be reflected on. But just the kind of practices of, what it means to attend to each other in charity, to seek to discern the mind of Christ across difference, rather than it just being a kind of business meeting or a politicizing over getting one's position through or whatever it might be, but a real discerning, which takes the views of all as weighty rather than simply as ancillary to the ordained minister. So that's a kind of real example, a real practice. And there are, if you look on the website of Churches Together in England, there are some great resources that Callan Slipper has put together in partnership with Churches Together in England that would help resource this kind of process at local level.
So very helpful, and we will send an email this afternoon with a number of resources, the things that have been referred to here. But even better, to your last resource, we are really fortunate to be able to be joined by Callan Slipper now, and so Callan is the National Ecumenical Officer of the Church of England, and he's able to join us from England live now, and to give us some response to what he's been hearing, and we'll draw Callan into this discussion now. So thank you for being with us.
It's actually very difficult for me to limit what I'd like to say, because there's been so many really interesting points that have emerged in what's going on so far. Yes, indeed, there are resources on the our Churches Together in England website. There's the Toolkit for Local Ecumenism. It's all free, and you can download it, and it's in English, of course. So, just Google Churches Together in England, and you can find it there. I think one of the things I'd like to comment upon, which kind of follows on with also from what Paul has just been saying, is the joy I experience in seeing Catholics and Baptists in conversation with one another. It's true that sort of a formal level, Catholics and Baptists might look as if they are on polar opposite ends of, say, what it is to be church. But I don't think it's really that true when you burrow down behind it. And my observation has been that generally in ecumenism, where we differ most, we have most to learn from one another. And that's because even in our very differences, there are deeper commonalities. And one of the things that intrigues me, the Baptists are very strongly congregationalist in their tradition. So listening to church meeting is this sort of like the supreme authority. Whereas Roman Catholics focus very much upon personal authority. But both are means that either church is using to try and discern the mind of Christ. So there is a deeper commonality there. And if you push it even further, if you look at both traditions, they actually contain both elements. At the moment, the Pope is wishing to enhance synodality within the Roman Catholic Communion, but councils and people taking counsel together are part of the Catholic tradition. It might not have been focused upon, but it's certainly present. And likewise, personal authority is known within the Baptist tradition. And so actually, all the elements are there in different forms. What we have to learn from one another is how to use these elements in order to discern the mind of Christ. And then as we mature as Christians, as Paul was also putting forward as a possible model for growing in unity, then that will help our churches to grow and to change. I'd like just to make one other point. I've got tons of others, but one other, which is a kind of a witness, really. Next week, together with Churches Together in England, we will have 108 ecumenical officers from across England meeting together for training. They come from all different churches. They are training together. Those who are training them are the ecumenical officers of a wide range of churches. And in particular, there are 5: Baptist, Roman Catholic, Anglican, United Reformed, and Methodist. The point I want to make here is that really, while it's a great joy to see ecumenism working between two traditions, we're always in concert with one another. And there are tremendous opportunities that are there, but the great joy that I experience is that together with my fellow national ecumenical officers of the other churches, I have to say, we have an experience of already living in a profound communion with one another. And I think that's an element that really needs to be focused upon. It's something which Steve was kind of talking about earlier on with his, he didn't use the term, but only a realized eschatology. The real reason why we're doing ecumenism is so that we can join more deeply together in the life of God. That's the ultimate fruit. sort of the living church. The real beauty of it is, it seems to me, that we can already do that. We can live deeply in communion with one another. It seems to me that depending upon our attitudes in this particular moment, we can be already realizing that eschatological vision because we are present to one another. So we can theologize it in any way we like, but being present to one another, we can then have the presence of Christ among us, who says he will be among us when we are present to one another. So that's an interesting and wonderful thing, but also in the moments when things are really tough, we're united through sharing the same cross which Jesus took upon himself, so in him too there. So I think it's really hopeful because of what is already happening and what actually is already possible, because the final goal is already available to us, not fully realized in all of its external manifestations, those have yet to come. But in the absolute heart of it, in sort of a spirituality of unity, then we have that opportunity.
Thank you so much. This is, maybe I could put a question in that actually came into us from the former director of ecumenism and interreligion dialogue for the U.S. Catholic bishops has asked a question in here. Father Alfred Baca, I believe is how it's pronounced. And so he just says everything that he's heard really resonates with him and his experience from what you all have been saying. He says, part of the problem, I think, is the fear of where we may end up if we begin to journey together. And he says that before his time ended at the USCCB, he was putting together a study of baptism between Baptists and the Catholic Church. And he wondered if there's any usefulness in that document and in that kind of sacramental focus on baptism. So I wondered if that might be something you all could respond to, maybe starting with Steve.
Oh, yes, I think so. One thing that I frequently tell Baptists in trying to clear up misperceptions about Catholics and also enrich their own baptismal theology is to mention that while the authority for deciding such cases rests with the local bishop, in many cases, a Catholic parish, a Catholic priest will receive as a valid baptism the baptism of a Baptist who is now coming into the communion of the Catholic Church. This is an important thing to note, a Catholic recognition of the validity of Baptist baptisms as baptism into the one Church of Jesus Christ. There are Baptist congregations that might not reciprocate that, but there are some Baptist congregations that have intentionally begun to recognize that baptism, wherever it takes place chronologically, is the one baptism into the Church of Jesus Christ, which partakes of common elements, nurture, Christian nurture, catechesis, incorporation into the life of the church. Of course, the obvious things like water and the formula, the baptismal formula of the triune God as the one in whose name we are baptized. Where those common features can be recognized, many Baptist congregations have received those who had been baptized as an infant, and yet for whom these other things have been realities in their Christian journey as well, fully as members of the church without rebaptizing. So yes, I think there are all kinds of openings for convergence over baptism between Baptists and Catholics, and that has been some of the focus of our dialogue at the international level. It's in the book too.
Catholic learning around baptism has been Catholic ecumenical learning around baptism has been one of the most important features of the last 150 years of Catholic life, and it comes to a point of flower or certainly it comes to a point of visibility and significance in the Vatican II documents. But we can trace that right back to John Henry Newman, and John Henry Newman, that great gift of evangelical and patristic and Anglo-Catholic tradition into Catholicism, bringing Catholicism back to remember that in baptism, each and every one of us is baptized into the threefold ministry of Christ as prophet, priest, and king. And there is still so much important learning within Catholicism to do that is vital to Catholicism's own flourishing and making progress with some sticky issues for us. And we are only going to learn that by continuing to learn from, receive from, particularly our Protestant sisters and brothers with such a strong sense of what baptized mission and ministry is. So it's as the youth say, or at least they used to say, it's a no-brainer. It's just a no-brainer from a Catholic perspective of what we have to learn here and how we can find ourselves in communion, in richer communion, through understanding of theology and practice of baptism. I just also want to thank Callum for his beautiful words. And Callum, one of your gifts is to help us appreciate the spirituality of ecumenism. Ecumenism not simply as a task and a responsibility and a weight, but actually as a key way of living, the whole Christian thing. I like to think of the whole Christian thing is best summarized as into the way of love. And I think ecumenical relating in all different strange bits of our lives, things that don't even look very ecumenical, like the parochial pastoral council and how we could do it better. I think it's all about a spirituality of ecumenical relating on the way of love.
Yeah, well, obviously I would agree. It seems to me that there's a conversion that we all need in all of the churches, and I speak in first instance for the Church of England, but I don't think many people disagree with me in this, that the real recognition of the need of ecumenism and the real recognition of a real living life of unity is not strong enough. It's not part of our culture. If you were to ask any bishop of the Church of England if they think that ecumenism is a good idea, I'm pretty certain they would say yes. And if you were to push harder, they would say, well, yes, it's linked to mission. We can't achieve proper mission without being one as Jesus asked us. That's great. And that really, I think, is heartfelt. But I'm not sure it's part of our culture. In fact, I'm sure it is not part of our culture. The churches don't organize themselves around the spiritual reality of ecumenism. And I think that is deeply tragic, because if we want to see what God's charter for mission is, it starts with our unity. And it seems to me that we, in terms of mission, we're missing a considerable trick here in terms of not being focused upon the joyful reality of what God has given us in Christ, the possibility of already being one in a living way. So it seems to me that there is a call here for all of the churches to grow in unity, and that means living the same basis that we have for growing in unity with one another across traditions, but also within our churches. So I think this is sort of a root and branch call for unity that is needed, and it's not just for our benefit. It's because that's the motor of mission. And any kind of mission, any definition of mission we wish to use, fits in with that. I mean, if you take the Anglicans' 5 marks of mission that go from proclamation to care for creation via social action and political action too. The soul of all of those things is enhanced when we truly live that spirituality of communion. If I may, I'd just like to add one other point. I think that the whole conversation about baptism is really interesting, because it also frames some of the things that we can learn from one another in terms of when we are living more deeply in communion, because we become able to hear what one another has to say. And it becomes, as it were, a hotbed of receptive ecumenism. One of the things that Anglicans have learned in our conversations with Baptists is to recover, really, that baptism is fundamentally something for adults, although we fully and happily, joyfully baptize children too. The other thing that we've learned from one another, though, in conversation is that baptism is part of a process, and it has helped us tremendously to have a deeper rapprochement between the two traditions, when we realize, as I say, that it is there's a process there. So I'd like really then to close by emphasizing these 2 points: the spirituality of communion, the spirituality of unity, but that then opens up the possibilities for a real profound learning and sharing in the mode of receptive ecumenism. And I mean, if we look at all of this, look at the possibilities, I mean, the future is brilliant, but we need a culture change.
You identify a mismatch there, Callum, between the number of church leaders and committed Christians who would automatically agree that, of course, ecumenism is a good thing. Of course, it's a very good thing. Like Christmas, we can't do without it. But then it doesn't somehow kind of get a priority in practice. Now, I've got this theory going that one of the reasons for that is because there's always quite a long list of really good things that we should be doing, and they tend to kind of be, in different boxes. So there's the social mission good thing that we should be doing. There's the forming the youth good thing that we should be doing. There's the preaching the gospel to those who've never heard it good thing that we should be doing. And there's also this ecumenical good thing that we should be doing. And actually possibly trumping all of that is keeping the church open good thing that we should be doing, and getting new members, and kind of just doing everything else that we've got to do. So I've got this theory that for as long as ecumenism is a kind of one good thing amongst others, it's never really going to get there, because other than for the ecumeniacs who have kind of somehow fallen in love with this as the way in which they live the Christian thing. So one of the things I find attractive about receptive ecumenism is it's trying to say, you know what, ecumenism isn't just a good thing, it's really good for us. It's really good for us, because we've got all these kind of problems, if we're going to be honest. I mean, it's difficult to be honest about something. It's difficult to be honest about ourselves. It's difficult to be honest about something that we're really committed to, something that we love, like our church, our tradition. But when we are honest, we've all got problems. And the promise of receptive ecumenism, it's saying it's not just one more good thing to do that you should feel guilty about and try and get on and give a bit more time to. It's saying this is a resource. This can help us. This can help us with our problems, because we're like hamsters running around a wheel, trying to get somewhere, but we get nowhere other than repeating and reinforcing the same old patterns. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to Greg for a minute, because I think Greg is going to draw things to a formal close, but then in a way that we live in a Christian world where there's always more grace. And I think Greg is going to say either the good news or the bad news, that for those who wish it, there's always more of this as well now. Are you with us, Greg, to be able to do that?
While we're waiting for Greg to reappear, I'll jump in and try to lend some urgency to the points that Callan and Paul have just made by taking the liberty, that although I'm focusing on Baptist Catholic ecumenical dialogue here, of invoking an Anglican and quoting from Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who during the mid-1980s said to the World Council of Churches that the challenge of apartheid, or apartheid itself, was too strong for the divided church. I think today we might say that the contemporary manifestations of racism are too strong for the divided church. We could invoke lots of other things: nationalism, populist authoritarianism, the COVID-19 pandemic, the ecological emergency that is upon us. These things are too strong for the divided church. But the united church that is progressing toward being more visibly united through receptive ecumenism and other means, that is the church that is able more fully to be a part of this big community-making thing that God is doing in the world and is already bringing about.
Amen to that, Steve.
Yeah.
Greg and Matteo, who are hosting us this evening, are you able to chip in now, Greg, or are you wanting me to?
Yes, I'm sorry. I've had a unique problem with my connection, so my apologies. What I've heard has been wonderful and has stayed engaged. I just want to say two things real quickly. If you have to leave now, the main program for the first hour, we're at the top of the hour now. I do want to let you know we are going to stay on. We're going to leave cameras on. Paul and Steve and Callan have all agreed to just stay on for another 10 to 15 minutes of conversation and looking at some of the questions that you've all sent in. So if you are able to stay around, please do. We will send an email, as I mentioned earlier, that will have a link to Steve's book and to places where you can get Steve's book. We will also have a number of other resources that have been mentioned. Some of them that you all in the chat box, Q&A box have mentioned, but others that Paul and the others and Steve have all mentioned different resources. So we will definitely include those in the follow-up email, as well as a link to this conversation so that you can share it with others that had maybe not been able to be here. Because I think we all feel like this has been a really, really unique time and set of insights. So if you do have to leave, take care. But for others, we will be here. We're going to stick around here for the next 10 to 15 minutes and just continue to carry forward with this discussion. As I mentioned, I kind of got with my connection the first time this has happened in all these different webinars. So you may have covered this, but we had an interesting question that came in from Nathan Smith, who I think Paul had mentioned earlier had hosted a webinar with Paul last week. And so I'll just bring Nathan's question into this and see if you all have a response. He says, as a Baptist with its local focus and autonomy within churches, how can we encourage reception of things like the published bilateral discussions and insights from Receptive Ecumenism with such a large web of individual churches? And so he's asking that as a Catholic and wonders if the Baptists in the room Steve could answer and reflect on that.
I think that for Baptists, that does mean that the role of institutions of theological education is important. This is where we form ministers, and I hope that ecumenical formation might be a part of the formation of ministers so that they see this as not this optional, interesting thing, but something that is absolutely vital to their ministry in local places where the full ministry of the church will be accomplished only if they are doing it in collaboration with other ministers and other churches from a wide variety of Christian traditions. In the Catholic tradition, there is a directory for the implementation of the principles of ecumenism that identifies the important role that institutions of Catholic theological education might have, and that sees ecumenical formation as essential to the formation of priests for ministry. This is something that I think we can do together, and that Baptist and Catholic institutions might indeed be able to do together, informing their ministers for seeing this as important on the ground at the grassroots.
Thank you. There's a very interesting question that came in from a Jesuit priest who actually used to be a Protestant pastor and taught at a Baptist university for a time. And he says in his recent experience in discussions with other theological educators, they've observed that among the younger generation, their observation is the people in their 20s and 30s, it's difficult to motivate them and get them engaged in ecumenical interactions and dialogues. And he wondered if that's your all experience as well. And if there's, you actually just mentioned theological training, Steve, but he has another question about, have you all experienced, any types of resistance, either from younger people in those dialogues, or from people in authorities in the two different churches?
In my own experience with younger persons, whether college students or people after college training for ministry, is that on the one hand, that they get ecumenism intuitively, but they also see many of the divisions as really being silly. We are one. We have these unifying spiritual realities in our life in Christ. What's the big deal? Now, sometimes doctrine may be seen to be an obstacle, and unfortunately, that can sometimes lead to a kind of theological approach to Christian identity. Doctrine is the source of all these divisions, so let's not emphasize that too much, and let's just emphasize the spiritual unity that we already have in Christ. And so as a teacher of theology, I try to help younger persons see that theology is important, and in fact, it's important to be theologically grounded in one's own tradition in order to know what some of the resources are that we might be able to share with others, and in order to know what some of the resources, especially theological ones, are that are elsewhere that we might need to receive ourselves.
If I may, I think this is a question which is a subset of some of the stuff that Paul was commenting on earlier on, about ecumenism being one of the list of things to do. Because along with receptive ecumenism, we have the problem actually of ecumenical reception. And it's a real problem. And I think it's not just sort of younger people training for ministry. The agreements that there are between the churches are not known within the churches. And the hunger for a real living unity is not as strong as ecumeniacs like myself would like it to be, because without that hunger, we're not going to achieve the reality of full reconciliation among the churches. So it's a whole church question, this one. It certainly involves the people studying for ordination, but it involves also lay people. And what is really necessary is this change in culture. And it seems to me that receptive ecumenism is one real part of that, but actually there's something which is core to receptive ecumenism, which is almost prior. And that is to say, to recognize the need we have of one another. I think the big problem is that we actually think we don't need one another, and we can kind of join in occasionally with one another. One dimension of receptive ecumenism is that it starts from recognizing our neediness, and that the gifts to heal us exist elsewhere in the body of Christ. But another way of saying a similar sort of thing is recognizing our neediness in the sense of being fully united with one another when we go out to the world. So we're not only, as it were, being ecumenical in order to become missional, we are doing our mission ecumenically. And it is demonstrably more effective when we do that. So I think we need to tell the stories of when it is more effective. And we need to find ways of deepening a culture that makes us more receptive of the whole body of Christ, more appreciative of them all. We have this in this country, in England, in spades, because we don't even recognize the rest of the world exists some of the time, so, let alone other churches.
Thank you. Somebody just a short question. Somebody just from Canada was wondering if you have specific things that are happening in Canada along these issues of ecumenical encounter.
In Baptist Catholic, Greg, or across other traditions?
I think he's speaking more generally in ecumenical and receptive ecumenism in Canada.
Right. In terms of receptive ecumenism in Canada, it might be fruitful. My only real knowledge in the Canadian context is of Anglican Catholic encounter at a number of levels, and I know that a great deal has been done with ARC Canada, Anglican Catholic Dialogue in Canada, and it may well be that if they search the web, there will be some interesting links there for materials. Archbishop Linda Nichols, who is the primate of the Anglican Church in Canada, and Archbishop Don Boland are the co-chairs of ARC Canada, and they're both very experienced ecumenists, very committed to the receptive ecumenical way of working. So there's all sorts of interesting things have happened there.
Thank you. Boy, there are so many really, really good questions. Somebody mentioned we actually have a book coming out later in the year, early next year, by Karen Peterson Finch, who's done a lot on grassroots ecumenism and is now in Canada as well. And there are a number of questions, kind of related to this question of the grassroots and of efforts in different areas. But we also have some questions related to some of these we're probably at the point where we don't quite have time to tackle any of the larger questions that are still in there. What I'd like to do before we end is just to give each of you a moment to kind of give us some concluding thoughts from our time together. Steve, would you like to start? Or Paul? Go ahead, Paul.
One thing that's still running through my head from some of the previous exchanges is that we're not all moving in the same way at the same time. That's not just about the lives of us as individuals in our different churches, but also where we are with what the ecumenical thing is. Now, I share deeply a sense with Callan and Steve that say a post-denominationalism that sort of says, well, it doesn't really matter, we should just kind of mix and do what we can together and enjoy that, and don't be worried about all that structural stuff. That's the old churches or whatever. I do see that as ultimately needing to be complemented and deepened and enriched by the desire for and the journey towards full communion. But there's another part of me that thinks, generally, I'm not going to convince somebody who that's where they're at and where their ecclesial context is at. I'm probably not going to convince them by arguing them into it that they need to have something richer. I might persuade them by showing them a bit, or they might be persuaded by seeing it over time and reflecting on it. And there's also different ways, and the spirit is like a kind of 10-stroke engine, or it's like a million-stroke engine. There's all sorts of different movements happening, and I think we just, for those of us who have been drawn by the call to be one, and drawn by the desire for a deepened communion that more adequately expresses the communion of God, then I think we need to try and focus on finding ways to live that well, and to show it well, and to show its attractiveness well, and the value of it as a key aspect of Christian calling. That's our responsibility. Our responsibility isn't to achieve the whole. We're bit parts. We are bit parts. We are pixels. We are pixels in a great pluriform icon.
Thank you, Paul.
One thing that's been going through my mind, especially as we were talking about the perspectives of younger people on ecumenism, and maybe sometimes seeing it as not quite as relevant or quite as important, is that I think they rightly recognize that the real points of division today in the church are not so much these classical ones between denominations over matters of doctrine in particular. They really are within denominations, and within denominations across denominations. They are ideological. They are divisions over how we understand how our Christian faith relates to the political order. They are divisions over a wide range of social issues. And I think the answer to that is that ecumenism is even more vitally important because of that. As we go deep in our own traditions, as we address openings for converging toward unity, hopefully we can gain the resources that we need for resisting what I might identify as a problematic or a false kind of ecumenism. And that's looking across the traditions and saying, here are these people who agree with me ideologically, politically, socially, so I'm going to be ecumenical and reach across our traditions and have common cause within. It's happening at both ends of the theological or political spectrum. But that's not the kind of unity for which Jesus prayed.
Thank you. Colin, go ahead.
Well, it seems to me that all of these questions, like so many other questions in the church, come down to really one fundamental thing, and that is the need to love. What we need, I think, in order to increase our ecumenism is a current of love. But I think we need something else. That something else is learning how to love. We think we know, but actually we're all of us fumbling around. I'm not brilliant at it myself. But in the same way that we know that, for example, spontaneous relationships in marriage or even our relationship with God in prayer, which is a deeply spontaneous thing, can be improved by learning how to do it, by learning the disciplines involved. I think we need to learn the disciplines involved in loving one another. So we're meeting together in God in our relationships. So I think one of the key things we need is a spirituality of relationships, so that we learn in a disciplined, profound way how to relate to one another. And that includes how to disagree and come eventually to a deeper understanding later on. It includes all the disciplines of receptive ecumenism. It includes the profound listening that you need and the ability to challenge in gentle ways in our theological dialogue. all of these things, they're all of them rooted around or centered around a spirituality of relationships.
Well, thank you all. And thank everybody for joining us. This has really been a fruitful time. There's so many excellent questions and even responses and conversations happening as this has gone on. And really from around the world. It's been very interesting to note that. And so when we send our follow-up email, we'll also send along the contacts for all three of our guests today, so that if you want to carry this forward with them in your own, personal correspondence with them, they have agreed to let us do that, and they would welcome any responses that you all have. But for now, we'll leave it here. We'll thank you all very much for being with us, and we hope to see you again the next time. Take care.